comments, and maybe we can give some detail.
Questions? Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Bob McNamara. Dan mentioned at the outset that this earlier period was one in which was considered recently a high water mark in the York Legislature. And I was thinking, well, that was true for a lot of other legislatures in the country. This was at the period of legislative institutionalization. You had speakers like Jess Unruh in California, other people in other states. And it's sort of that's when New York was rated relatively highly. NCSL put out stuff. Citizens Conference on Effective Legislatures put out a lot of stuff. They were rating legislatures in terms of their internal capacity and assertiveness. Right? Since then, you've had so basically term limits movements, a bunch of other stuff has emerged, and the popularity of legislatures nationwide, not just state legislatures, has been on the decline. Right? And the reporting of New York may be a somewhat pathological case, but it's not unusual. It's only unusual as to degree of dislike. Now, I thought, well, why is that? Which is the question part. Right? Because you guys are, so, yes.
Well, a professor of your distinction should have the answer.
You wrote the book.
With you. First, I make a long analysis of what happened in the New York Legislature and other venues. I talk about, and I argue, by the way, that what happened in the last 2 years is different than what happened before. And the degree to which we perceive a continuity, we are making an error. Because the issue of the problems that rose under the Democratic Senate were differently rooted than the problems that arose under divided control. I like to joke that I condemned divided partisan control and embraced the American Political Science Association 1950 some report on partisan control of the government. And then the Senate got captured by the Democrats, and facts got in the way of my analysis. Certainly the decline of political parties, organizations, had consequences for the nature of accountability in the legislature, divided partisan control, entrenched by malapportionment, the concentration of partisan resources in the conferences, the individualization of politics, so that people each campaigned on their own and built their own organizations, as opposed to reliance on an organization, organizational support, the potential therefore for loss of discipline through the organization for delivering outcomes. All these things are, so it's a complex, multivariate explanation for why it became a disjunction, as we discussed earlier, just when we said below, a disjunction between the institutional arrangements designed in a certain socioeconomic frame, certain and the capacity of that institution to be effective in a new socioeconomic and political environment. So that's a complicated 30-second summary of a really long analysis, and I think that it raises some. Let me go on for one more second, because I'm kind of provoked. I gave a paper yesterday at the York Penn State Law School, and on this topic of convention phobia that was raised or mentioned, and the fundamental point is that our institutional capacity to alter our institutions is diminishing. So the adaptability of our institutions, which was very great, especially in state government, relative to national government, in a formal sense, not by informal adjustment, but the adaptability. We haven't had a constitutional convention at the state level authorized in a generation. They used to be common. All the automatic convention questions across the country in the 14 states where there are automatic questions and giving people an opportunity, all these questions are systematically and universally rejected. So there's a certain, I think some interest group theorists write about mature interest group systems. There's a certain hardening of the arteries that's occurring in the political system. So the adaptive mechanisms of our institutions seem to have diminished. Now these are big ideas that require lots of evidence and lots of study, maybe a little more than speculation for me, But I think that's manifest in New York. We have a disjunction between our institutional arrangements and the nature of the problems that they need to solve in the political environment that we've created.
I want to give a much more superficial answer to that question.
He's only an associate professor.
And worse than that, the first part of my answer is even worse than that. The first part of my answer is a cheap political partisan shot. As follows. When I was at an impressionable age, growing up in 1961, 62, I had a president that said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And the generation like myself, who were in legislatures in the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, even maybe, well, let's say 70s and 80s, were influenced by that mode of thinking. I would suggest that 20 years later, 1981, 82, we had a president that said, government is not the solution, government is the problem. The people at an impressionable age at that point, I suppose, quite a few of them, ended up in the legislatures in, 1995 or 2000. Now, if people come to the legislature with the notion that government is the problem, not the solution, exactly who was going into the legislature at that point? Now, I'm not suggesting that as a terribly serious answer, but I think it's part of a broader and more pervasive problem, which may also help to explain the decline that you mentioned from legislatures throughout the country in that earlier period compared to legislatures now. And that is a general loss of commitment to the common welfare. Not only in politics, in society in general. And I say this at the risk of, things were so much better when I was younger. I mean, of course, we're younger, so it's even better. But even discounting for that, it seems to me that throughout our society, the balance between personal interest and the common welfare has shifted enormously toward the personal interest. It's not, I'm hardly the first to say that in the heroic periods of American history, whether it's the founding or the Greatest Generation or even the New York City fiscal crisis, what distinguished those periods were that a variety of sectors were willing to set aside their personal interest toward the common welfare. And I just don't see much of that today. And I think if we don't return to some kind of commitment in that regard, let me put it positively, I think we need to return to that kind of commitment in order to improve the performance of legislatures and many other institutions in our society.
Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I'm very unsophisticated compared to these other folks, but I think getting one group entrenched, whether it be the Republicans or the Democrats, does lead to rigidity and avoidance of current problems and so forth. And I wonder, I think what you said, people's experience when they were in their formative teens, and the whole approach is very apt. I'm an economist, and in the 70s, when I would ask students, I would explain to them what is progressive taxation, proportional taxation, and regressive taxation. And it's based on the percentage of taxes for low income, middle income, and high income people. And at first, they would say they thought progressive taxation was fairer. And by 1982, the students were clearly in favor of proportional taxation. Again, a shift in the whole approach to things. But then you have these same people running things for quite a long time, and frankly, it becomes dysfunctional. And you suggested that you just need to get some new blood running. But it isn't clear how you're going to do that.
Well, the two reforms I think are most important are taking districting out of the hands of legislators, putting some distance between the decisions on what legislative districts will look like, putting some distance between the people who make that decision. I'm not naive about it being apolitical, but putting some distance. And second, paying for the overhead of democracy publicly. By that I mean financing elections. I regard, I talk to my students about the heating bill and the lighting bill. You got to pay the heating bill and the lighting bill. And in a democracy, in a Republican system, you've got to pay for the elections so that people with special interests don't pay for them and therefore have a special claim on those who get elected. Now I know I was identified as a Republican, and this is not presumptively a Republican position. But I just think you're driven to that result. Now, I don't think, given the demographics of New York, I don't think that we'll necessarily get competition everywhere in New York as a result. We'll get more competition than we have now, however, and that will be a good thing. And then Dan talked about intra-party competition, and I think that also, but public financing would also encourage that. Now, I'm less interested in, I wrote a book with Mike Melvin that was published here, published by CQ Press, but written here, in which Melvin was against term limitation, and I was for it. And having associated with Melvin, I discovered that he was a lot smarter than I was. The reason to have term limitation was because elections didn't work. So it's a second best choice. But in New York City, there's been some salutary outcomes from term limitation. It's encouraged people to compete for other offices, for one thing, which is very clear. So although there is downside from the operation of the institutions within which it operates, I'm not going to detail that. And it has certain limitations as a way of, it turns out, it cuts the tall timber, as one of my colleagues said. It turns out the very best people and the very worst people without discrimination. It might be an ancillary to other reforms in some structural circumstance. The other thing that I'd say, since I'm holding forth here, is that we tend to discuss alternatives in very limited ways. So we say, are you for term limit or against term limit? So are you for initiative or you're against initiative? And anybody who's serious and looks at, say, these arrangements knows that the institutional design is very complex. There are a lot of alternatives within these categories. So my general view is that a smart group of people gathered to consider structural reform of New York can go some serious distance toward making things better, although that's not the whole answer.
Bob?
A question for Dan Feldman. In the book, you talk about your experiences dealing with a number of issues, writing laws related to a number of issues from a very large scale, like the Rockefeller drug laws and the Organized Crime Control Act, to things that might be considered more parochial, but I'll bet a lot of your constituents found more important, like letting people off the hook if they get to their car just as it's being towed. Could you talk about any one of those issues, if you like, but also if you could talk about, going back to your comment about the three men in the room being a false concept, which I agree with. What proportion of issues does the leadership or does the single leader really care enough about? Of all the bills that get passed in a given year, how many are really up to you and the other members who simply have the initiative to put them forward, and they're not, politically large enough to rise to the leadership level, but perhaps important to your constituents?
All right. Well, I'm going to say something that's going to appear to contradict what I said earlier. I did often, partly for purposes of shock value, explain to my newer colleagues when I've been there a while. I said, you understand, the committee system exists to kill your bills. And there's a lot of truth to that. And the basis for it is this. the Speaker in the Assembly, and I believe the Majority Leader in the Senate, comes into the session with a vision of what that person sees as where they want to go during the session, understanding that outside forces, happenstance, and so forth will alter it. But the leader of the House has his or her own agenda and vision, and also feels, as anyone in public life does, that resources are limited. Here's what I want to accomplish, and I can't afford to get distracted too much, because if I use up my chips, I won't be able to get done what I want to get done. So that's why the committee system exists, to kill your bills, because the burden is on you to force the direction of the session away from where the Speaker wants it to go. Now, of course, if it's a very minor issue, I mean, my tow truck thing, I think it wasn't a substantial, there was not substantial opposition to that one. However, there was very serious opposition to my earlier effort to make the Parking Violations Bureau pay you if they hound and harass you beyond all reason for a ticket that you already paid, or sent in proof that you should have got in the first place. That took me 6 years to get through, because one official reason, or neither reason was official, let me take that back, but one somewhat well-intentioned reason. Koch's Budget Bureau kept saying to him, if we upgrade the computer system so that it actually recognizes that these people paid it or sent in proof of it, it's going to cost us a lot of money to upgrade it. And if we do that, we'll therefore have to stop collecting what is now 1/6 of the revenues from all these people who we make it so difficult for them to fight the system. They say, oh, I'd rather pay. So we spend money in order to lose more money. So the Koch administration fought this bill for 6 years. If it would get, once it got to the floor, obviously it's going to pass. So it got it through the Assembly the second or third year. It took a long time for it to get through the Senate, but when it finally did, they made sure it was a slightly different bill, and there was somehow they couldn't get the two bills to have the same wording. So there are all these tricks to prevent it from happening. So that was a bill that doesn't seem to be of great consequence either, but the leadership wasn't willing to pay the price to fight Mayor Koch in order for that to pass. I mean, I wanted that to happen, but in their view of the larger scheme of things, here are my chips, here's what I have to play with. I'm not spending it on fighting Koch on this issue. Right? I mean, eventually it passed because I just made it sufficiently embarrassing for everybody with the press that they passed it. And I must say, to his enormous credit, years later, when Ed Koch endorsed me for Congress, he said I had big fights with Dan Feldman when he was in the Assembly, and he was right.
Now, Dan, you didn't give the other reason why this was sensitive.
Oh, yes, well, the other
people were stealing
right, the second reason was that Stanley Friedman and his buddies, and Don Mattis and his buddies, were taking a piece of all this. So, as later turned out, they didn't want the revenues diminished at all. So, I don't think it got us aware of that, but there were other people I suspect who were, and they were also fighting the bill. So yeah, I forgot. Thanks for reminding me. So how much of the legislative agenda will the leadership control? More than you think, because things that may seem minor to you as a legislator, and you say, well, why the heck can't they pass this bill with limits? There's usually somebody who opposes it, and one could argue that leadership is being cost effective. Do I want to spend my chips on that? Even if it's only a few chips. I mean, every legislator, if I did everything that every legislator wanted, it would be a few chips here, a few chips there, and I'd have nothing left to do what I really want to do. So you have to. So it takes a lot of effort for an individual legislator to override the will of the leadership and get through what they need to get through. One story that I don't know if I tell this in the book or not, but
I'm really kind of, this is the second time that happened today.
What?
These great stories come out that aren't in the book.
Sorry.
How many times have I asked you to tell me the story?
It's true. And then he asked me a lot, really, a lot of what's in the book is because Joy said, well, what about that? I said, oh yeah, okay. You know, believe me, this would have been a much, much worse book, but at this time. No, but this was applicable not only to politics. I mean, it's most important, I think, in politics, and I would urge this to anybody that does run and don't get elected to office, but it's really transcends politics. When I was about 11 years old, I had an uncle who was a teacher of the deaf, and it just dawned on me one day that some of his students were born deaf. And so I said, gee, Uncle Al, it must be really hard to teach somebody a word if they've never heard a word. And he said, yes, it can take 6 months to teach them one word. So I said, oh, that must be so frustrating. He says, no, you don't understand. When they learn that word, you feel really good. Well, I carried that with me, and it does take a phenomenal amount of effort to get even a little good thing accomplished. And I think one problem that creates is that legislators get very frustrated. And they either they leave the legislature or they say, oh, this is ridiculous, and it's not worth it, and so their focus shifts to their more personal interests, or else they get an ulcer or whatever. I think it's very important, as a legislator in particular, but probably in any field, to take great satisfaction in whatever small improvements you can make, and not let the rest of it drive you nuts. I mean, you know, keep trying to fight the big battles, but take satisfaction in those little accomplishments. And I think that's what kept me going, and I commend that certainly to anybody in the legislature, and really to anybody.
There's one interesting point that Dan made, and we discussed gun control legislation, various approaches to this matter. Actually, more through litigation, through the Attorney General, when he was working at the Attorney General's office. And there was some initial success in strong, having to do with law enforcement officers being constrained in carrying their weapons off duty. And the point you made was that there are people alive today who wouldn't be alive if we didn't pass this law. Now, it's kind of interesting that maybe not a lot of people, maybe 10 people, 20, but there are actually people walking around. You don't know who they are, but you know, statistically, you know for sure that outcome happened. That's pretty powerful. You know, if that's the kind of if that's the line of work you're in, and so you know that's pretty important to raise the people's consciousness, in my opinion.
Dan, I'm going to comment on one comment you made.
Could you identify yourself, sir?
My name's Dave Roos, and I've been around longer than I probably should have. And I'm not an academic, so excuse me. But Dan, you commented on the passions that occur in the discussions in the conference and the assembly, and I'm sure that's equally true in the Senate. And I think this is very accurate. But the problem is that those are secret. Nobody knows what is said there, and this is the one place where I believe that you could say that legislators really let their hair down and it's not orchestrated. Would the public weal, the common weal, be improved if there was some means where that could become public, or would it just, you know, once again cover, inhibit debate? And then the second question, which is somewhat related to this, is reform is a very nice thing. It's talked about a lot. You said you're a reformer. Well, chaos also eventually breeds authoritarianism. Do you think maybe there's a possibility we're over-reforming?
Two great questions. On the first one, my belief, I'm not 1,000% certain of this, but my belief is that to the extent that the closed caucuses became open, the decisions simply wouldn't be made in caucus. In fact, that began to be true anyway, as I suggested. Key decisions are made in a phone call among a smaller number of people. So my feeling, again, I'm pretty sure of this, not 100%, but pretty sure, is that it would not serve the public to have these caucuses open. It would simply move the locus of real decision-making outside the caucus. On the second was a great question, and I was thinking about the first one. What's the second one?
Reform.
Oh, reform. That's
so good.
I have been feeling personally guilty to some extent about reform. Look, I still think of myself as a reformer, but I grew up in a part of New York where there were no Republicans. I mean, it was the Reform Democrats against the Organization Democrats. I mean, and we were the reformers, so the enemy were the corrupt political machine. And we thought, and I thought in those days, that the answer, the thing to do is to destroy or at least weaken the power of the machine. Well, that happened. And what was the result? There was a vacuum of power, which was filled by basically big money, either politicians with a lot of money themselves or politicians who raised money, large amounts of money from elsewhere. Now, I'm not saying that when the machine was in power, it didn't have a relationship to big money too. But at times, at least from time to time, the political organization did serve as an effective counterbalance to big money. My favorite example is, to me, the greatest governor New York ever had is Al Smith, who was clearly a creature of Tammany Hall, and who absolutely stood up to the power of big money to the benefit of the people as a whole, people at large. There were a lot less appetizing examples of the machine's power than Al Smith. But I think, I may want to turn this over to Jerry, because he has often explained very eloquently how the political machine at times played a very useful screening role, so that some nut with an awful lot of money, I can't think of any at the moment,
Might get nominated to Iowa.
whereas that really didn't happen to that extent when there was some degree of screening. I don't know if you want to.
Well, I actually I can talk about that. I can talk about virtually anything. But I wanted to come back to your point about deliberation. The legislature today is not a deliberative venue. Matters don't come to a vote, almost never come to a vote without assurance that they'll pass. The debate occurs, and sometimes, for example, we discuss the creation of a legislative record on certain where proposed statutes expected to pass, where the creation of the record is consequential for the court interpretation of the record. In fact, I think that that's really a very important part of this book. The idea that legislators think about that, as they debate, and they worry about it when people enter the debate with arguments that might be debilitating or raise constitutional questions that might undo the legislation. So that's, so there is a debate, and it's often symbolic, which is important. We also say in society that manipulation of symbols is fundamentally important in political institutions. It has a lot to do with representation and how people see their society and how their values get translated into action in society. But I think that there needs to be greater uncertainty in some venues, whether it's the committee or on the floor. And the degree to which there's greater uncertainty, there's more accountability. So how do you balance the need for discipline, which your reference to chaos is not irrelevant given our recent experience? How do you balance the need for discipline against the need for accountability and a greater degree of uncertainty, so we can get people further engaged and bring some greater credibility? And that's a question, partly a question of institutional design. And it has to do with a combination of factors. I think that the changing of the rules is an important focus. In other words, we talk about the Brennan Center report in the book a little bit. We talk about some of the rules changes that have occurred as a result. I think that's a potential focus. Liberating rules for liberating matters from committee to the floor. A rules committee that essentially is one person is not a good idea. So there are certain structural arrangements, but again, it's I don't want to sort of a cop out for me to say it's complicated. But it's a complex interaction of institutional arrangements, a testing and then a revision, and we're less and less able to reconstruct the relationships among our institutions, and we're certainly less able to revise once we learn. And that's a bad thing.
Jerry, I just wonder, it's Tom Hayes. I wonder if you could comment on a point that you already made. You were suggesting that perhaps we ought to take the redistricting power from the legislature itself. And I assume that one of the reasons is to create more competitive legislative elections. But I wonder if you could talk about your thinking, and you too, Dan, about what would happen if we actually had competitive legislative elections in New York State. I mean, it's possible, on the one hand, that you might have more concern or responsiveness to districts. Though it's also possible that you might have even more fear of any action on the part of the legislators, more risk-averse behavior. And it's also possible that if you have a lot of competitive elections, there would be even a greater premium on the ability to raise money, and that could mean even greater power of legislative leaders or party leaders. So I wonder if you could just talk through what would happen in the maybe unlikely event that we actually had competitive elections, say at the level of, maybe not at the level of the U.S. Senate, but something in between the U.S. Senate and what we're seeing in the
I could give the wise ass answer, which is always my first option, which is, we haven't done it, so let's try it. You know what we don't like, or at least I know what I don't. An insufficient response for a very thoughtful question. First, I wouldn't make only one change. I'd make a series of changes. So that the idea would be that not only members were less secure, and also the financing of elections was, as I say, differently done, but also that majorities could shift. If I had my druthers, I'd probably go to a unicameral system as well. I'd probably pick a size of districts where majorities would be more likely to shift if I could figure that out. A size of body.
Okay.
So I'm pretty radical on this, and the degree to predict pretty far out. I mean, we could look at experience in other places that have changing majorities across parties and more competitive legislative elections. One fear I have, and I have two fears, one as a Republican and one as an upstater. My fears are that a fair districting system would disadvantage rural areas permanently, or relatively permanently. And my other fear is that it would disadvantage Republicans relatively permanently, given the demographics of New York. But I think that the response to that is that the Republican Party has to get better at competing with its natural constituencies, the middle class across a range of ethnic groups who care about the kind of values that Republicans won't characterize in one way or another, but the values that Republicans would prefer to put at the center of their appeal. So the Republican Party would have to be, Republican people, candidates would have to be competitive to make New York politics competitive. So it's a complicated answer, and I think our capacity to predict is very limited. So you're right, it'd be sort of risky. But my bottom line on this has been, we know we're in a bad situation. Our risk-benefit calculation needs to be informed by our current situation. So what might be more risky at a time where we are reasonably content is less risky at a time where we have a high level of unhappiness. If in fact that's true, if the polls are true or my judgment is true on it.
I would just add three things. One, actually I support, I think Jerry's wise ass answer was a good answer, because, seriously, because, Hawthorne experiment, the mere fact that you make people pay attention for a while helps, right? So if you had more competitive elections, at least you get people interested. And if the public were watching and paying attention, that to me is in itself of value. Secondly, and this is, I think, may have been implied in Jerry's response, but of the two reforms that Jerry talks about, the public financing and the nonpartisan reapportionment, I would put the public financing first. In other words, make sure that gets done. Then you can go to the second one. And the third point I want to make is that that kind of, if you take at least direct control of reapportionment out of the hands of the legislative leaders, you accomplish something else too. And you reduce the ability of the leadership to draw the lines in a way that favors or disfavors the incumbent members of their own party. That is, one of the powers the leadership has is, if they don't like you, they can chop your district to bits, or they can maybe draw the lines to make you more vulnerable to a primary opponent. One of the stories I do tell in the book is, for those of you that read it, you might recall this one, back in '81, when we were talking about the reapportionment process. Eddie Sullivan, some of you remember, very, very nice guy, was his district, which included Columbia College at the time, the Upper West Side, but it included an area north of that was increasingly had a black minority population. He was a little getting worried about a primary from a potential black opponent. So Stanley had said, you know, you'll each come in to see me and talk about your district, and I'll try to accommodate you as best I can. So Eddie raised his hand in conference. He says, well, Stanley, wouldn't it be a good idea if a bunch of us would come in, you know, people from the area, those of us who were, you know, in districts next to each other, would come in to see you together so we can have the benefit of each other's, you know, of course, what he wanted was to hear what the others had to say. So the benefit of the information from the others. So Stanley says, he says, Eddie, I think that's an excellent idea. When you come in to talk to me about your district, you can bring in anybody you want to listen. So, now, of course, you know, with Stanley, it was funny, and we all love Stanley, but the reality is it's probably not such a great idea for the legislative leader to draw the district lines. It just it further reinforces that excessive centralization of power. Steve, you always have good questions. What?
Steve Elliott. Both of you seem to support the idea that the sclerosis of current institutions is due to special interests. But let me suggest that special interests really are correct, that a constitutional convention at this point might be catastrophic because the issues are so big now. What do you think?
I think you're wrong. If you agree with this, with that, I regard the convention as, well, first of all, is broad but not deep support in the public. I don't think there's full understanding, and there's very deep opposition in certain organized venues, organized public employee unions. My great friend and colleague Tom Ciccino's here. But I think we would agree that the public employee unions don't like this idea. I think it's a fundamentally conservative process. You have to, it requires 3 votes to do anything, 3 popular votes. You have to agree to host the meeting. You have to elect the delegates. You have to, you then have to accept the result. You know, and the people who are selected go to this meeting with a special purpose. And they feel special about what they're doing. Now, there are complicated issues having to do with the process that are used to defeat the idea. And I think that these have to be addressed antecedent to the opportunity. I don't think the legislature will call this kind of, will create an opportunity because they're a target of change and they don't, you know, they benefit from the situation. So it has to be by the automatic process that we have in our Constitution. Again, I might be talking about things people haven't attended to, but it's constrained by time and circumstance. And the automatic process, so the process objections have to be addressed first. And those, so for example, if legislators being delegates is a problem, then we should consider a dual office holding statute that bars their service or requires them to resign from the legislature if they wish to serve at a convention. If double compensation is a problem, then we have to find a statutory remedy to double compensation. And these things can be done. Or a constitutional remedy, which then is put before the body, and if the body doesn't act, at least it can't say, we're not ready because of all these disabilities, because it had an opportunity to deal with the disabilities and did not advance the remedies. You know, so I think that ultimately, no convention would produce a document that would fail at the polls, and therefore would keep away from some of the hot button points that would cause it to fail. Additionally, the work of the convention could be delivered to the people in pieces, as was done in 1938, and some pieces could be accepted and there'd be incremental progress, and some pieces might not be. So it's worthy of very long debate, and I'm sure I urge the Rockefeller Institute to bring us together, as it has in the past, on this topic, but it's not the topic of the day.
Can I just want to follow up on Steve's question a little bit with you, just to make sure I understand. I mean, what if the wave of public anger that we're seeing reflected in so many ways, let's say, produced a lot of delegates who would urge initiative and referendum, and we those of us who watch California know how terrific that's been there. But nonetheless, I mean, from my point of view, and I think yours, a disastrous outcome. But why do you think that the convention process would not produce something like initiative and referendum?
Well, it might. It might also produce the indirect initiative, which is a constrained kind of initiative process, not dissimilar from what's present in some states. It might have threshold requirements of ballot access that were constraining. It would depend on the circumstance. And if additionally, it might offer the people initiative and referendum separately from the whole document. You know, the question is, what's your risk-benefit calculation? Mm-hmm. But the Cuomo, and I've written with Cuomo on this, and he's argued, trust the democratic process. The current situation is really problematic, and I think that at the end of the day, I'd rather trust it and take a shot at it than I would not take a shot at it. I've been thinking about this for 30 or 40 years, and things haven't been getting better.
My name is Charlie Dawson. In the interest of full disclosure, I teach a graduate course here in legislatures. I'm also an Albany County legislator. We have a unicameral legislature, and we have open caucuses, Dave. And lastly, I work in the New York State Senate right now as advisor to the Senate Finance Committee Chairman. So in interest of full disclosure. Dan, what you said in the beginning, 30 years ago, the New York State Legislature was the golden age of the New York State Legislature. I came here to Albany then, and I was a young staffer in the Ways and Means Committee, and I don't think the public or the press was very generous with us then either.
That's true.
I came here to study public administration in this school, which has the only program, or did at the time, the only one in the world to teach staffers how to work in the legislature. There was a saying at the time, one of our mantras by a professor named Aaron Wildowski, who said, before a legislature can act wisely, it must first be able to act. So we were all about capacity building in those days. But you go back to 1952 under Governor Dewey, the state's first $1 billion budget was passed by the legislature unanimously before the end of February. Now, is that a functional legislature, or is that a rubber stamp legislature? Dan, there's a point you made about we don't know the power we have, we know the power we don't have. I'm trying to figure out, what is the legislature we have today? It can act, it has that capacity, but is it like an adolescent? It's still exercising those new powers that it's acquired over the years. We have gridlock at times, we have fights, we have that competition. They're co-equal, but they're not necessarily governing well. I say this as someone in the institution, but someone who can also look at it from outside. We've come a long way from the 50s to the 70s and 80s. To today, I think we tend to compare the present unfavorably with the past. Today, what do we have now? Where are we going in the future?
Well, first, I think I said somewhere along the lines that I'm a little skeptical of my own view there too, because things were, of course, better when we were younger, because we were younger. So I don't. altogether disagree with you. And beyond that, actually, another story, you're going to kill me for not mentioning the book, but I remember when...
I left some blank pages at the end. If you buy the book, you can write this stuff in.
Well, if you, and again, supporting your point that things, you certainly can't draw a line saying things were wonderful and now they're terrible. If you remember, there was a time when Saul Leprin was speaker, and there was some vicious headlines in the daily news exposing, quote unquote, these poker games with the lobbyists, with the underlying implication being that he must be taking their money in return for stuff. When those of us who knew about it actually knew that Saul was a terrible poker player, and he was. So a fellow who, fortunately, whose name I don't remember, but I actually don't remember, came, and he had been working in the legislature in the 50s, the late 50s. And he said to me, isn't it ironic? Poor Saul is getting excoriated for losing these poker games. He said, when I was here in the legislature, working as a staffer, my job, he said, was to change the money. That is, I would take the bag of cash, bring it to the bank, and exchange it for other bills in case the first ones were marked. And nobody said anything. He says, this was normal. People thought this was fine. So, it's clearly unfair.
The legislature was Republican, right, Dan? That's when the legislature was Republican?
Well, that's a massive error. I mean, the idea that only Democratic Party organizations were corrupt is, of course, a massive misrepresentation of the facts. I've called the courthouse rings across upstate New York. So.
Bob's point about the Republicans were the ones that challenged the governor institutionally, not the Democrats.
Yeah, because that's all there were.
It was Perry Durier leading the charge. And
well, let me just try to get more. Look, I think what I'm going to say is, I guess, elementary, but with all our defense and support of the legislature, I think I'm presuming to speak for both of us, I think we both would agree that it is in the nature of the legislature to want to spend too much, and it is in the nature of the governor's job to control that spending. So, anything we're talking about here is within that general constraint. Now, that's not to say that this precise boundary of Pataki v. Assembly is correct. I personally don't think it is. But neither of us, I don't think, would go so far as to say, well, the legislature should have much more, should control the budget. We're not saying that. And an effective legislature is not one that, rolls over the governor. However, I also don't think we can go back to a legislature that, as you said, simply rubber stamps the budget, a legislature that, that 5 or 6 legislators would share an office in the Capitol building with one staff. There simply wasn't any physical room for any staff to do budget analyses or anything else of note. By the architectural realities of the situation, they couldn't be an effective counterweight. We're not going back to that. So what is an effective legislature and how do you, we're operating with it. You're asking the biggest questions. I think we're looking at a one level below that. Given certain givens, how do you make the legislature operate more in the interests of the public, so to speak? And actually, my first answer to that is the public has to operate more in the interest of the public. Today, when every homeowner thinks the mortgage interest tax deduction is absolutely fair and right and the way things ought to be from the beginning of time, but it's terrible that tenants have rent protections, and tenants think rent stabilization, that's just and fair and God's will, but these homeowners get away with this horrible mortgage interest deduction, and everybody justifies their own piece of the pie. Everybody has some piece, and nobody justifies anybody else's piece. I think it starts there, and when the legislature is dysfunctional and gridlocked, partly it's because it's reflecting a public that is exactly the same way, that is not willing to submerge its personal interest toward any common interest. So I think this isn't, the problems here aren't only in the legislature. Having said that, the proposals that we've been talking about, some decentralization of power from the leadership, especially public financing of campaigns, and to me secondarily, kinds of redistricting, but a whole slew of legislative rules that would remind the legislature. I mean, I say they can fight the leadership, and they can, but it would be nice to shift the balance of power a little more, balance between leadership and membership, so that members are reminded that they have more power to fight the leadership. I mean, those aren't the level of analysis you're
Well,
talking about.
I think you're selling yourself short, because you said before, if you give up on the legislature, you're giving up on democracy.
Right.
And I think what your book is making people
Well, we say-
reconsider the legislature.
We say, in the last chapter, we say, the legislature, we pick up Brodsky's quote, some things we do well. I don't know if you saw that in the Times, right? And he also said we were swift boat. You know, the legislative it was partly a public relations problem.
Yeah.
Well, I think that was, I don't agree with that. But, we say that the legislature is quite diverse, for example. It reflects the diversity of New York. We say that its members are pretty good at advancing district interests. I very much like, and I've said in the book, that the legislature is a very good incubator of public policy, because we have the unlimited introduction of legislation, which I think is a very good thing, and those reformers who want to eliminate that are barking up the wrong tree. On a cost-benefit basis, that's not a good idea. We say that the legislature occasionally, not always perfectly, but is aware of its institutional interests and asserting them, not always well and not always successfully, but it is, especially the Speaker of the Assembly, but in both houses, has coalesced across party lines when institutional interests were at stake. So, and we talk about the Hevesy case or the Hevesy replacement as a massive misunderstanding of relative institutional roles. And what was interesting about that example is that how much the media brought into the governor's definition of the situation, which was at best extra-constitutional, and at worst completely unconstitutional as definition of the situation. So there's this problem of institutional reputation. Now what happened, and you're referring to long history, what happened was the legislature was empowered, but it was empowered in an environment where it's expected to be disciplined so that it could act. So the empowerment with the staff, which also occurred in near a time of partisan change and a relocation of political action, as well as empowerment of the institution, all those things converged. But we had empowerment of leadership, an empowerment of the legislature, but then political circumstances or governmental circumstances which action didn't occur. So there's a disjunction between the institutional structures and the location of power and the need for timely action. Now my friend and colleague Jeffrey Stonecash would say this is kind of in the natural order of things. It takes time and dissonance to come to conclusions, but I would say that New York is really an outlier, compared to other legislatures in this regard.
Okay. I think we had just one more question, quick one from Diane.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Diana Hinchcliffe. Going back, for those of us who are old enough to remember, what we refer to as the old days, there was an obligation. If somebody wanted to become an elected official, there was an obligation that they had to go through the steps, or in military terms, you would call it getting your ticket punched. So leaving aside all of the machine politics and everything that contributed to that, you had to first start at the local level. And then you went the next step and the next step. So by the time you got to the state legislature, this person understood the process, the role of committees, the interrelationship with leadership, how to debate, how to get along with their colleagues. My question to you is, do you feel, I feel that there has not been that grooming of a farm team that has happened in probably 2 generations, maybe more. Do you feel that that has contributed to the dysfunction of the current legislature? Because people now can run for Congress, they can run for state legislature with no prior experience whatsoever except the desire to be elected to office.
Well, that's part. I think that's part of the problem. I think I at least touched on earlier when I talked about the the decline of the political organization, the decline of the political machine. The machine did help enforce that. And that is one of the prices, I think, that we paid for the decline of the political organization.
One of my all-time favorite New Yorkers was Malcolm Wilson. Some of you may have known him. Extraordinary person. Wonderfully decent person, very smart person, and the unfortunate habit of trying to campaign in Latin, he told me that he, when he was recruited to the legislature as a young lawyer, he was called in to see the county leader. And he was told that after due consideration, this is what you call a peer review process. We used to talk about it for the presidency. He was going to be the nominee. He had aspired, he made himself available. He wasn't naive, but he was going to be the nominee. And he was told, you'll be the nominee. We will raise the money. We will run the campaign. You will be elected to the assembly, and you will represent us. But the implication was you're accountable to us. And he was accountable to Governor Dewey, as it happened, some was mentioned, through the party organization. If his vote was needed, Governor Dewey called the county leader. And this was true in the Senate and the Assembly. Now, the direct responsiveness of the legislature to the governor, I agree. I agree with the observation that wasn't entirely desirable, but that governor could deliver majorities. And current governors, however good they are, putting aside particular peccadillos and circumstances, are not good at that, and not expected to do that. So there were advantages and disadvantages to the old system, but it did outside extra governmentally create a discipline and process and a review process. If the people in the review process were responsible and smart people and good people and honest people, that worked pretty well. When they were not honest people, it didn't work very well at all.
Okay, well, thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Dan.